Jones and Laughlin produced a frightening experience. He must rely on knowledge. Could he win at bridge without knowing the rules, or in a chess game without knowing how to answer his opponent's moves? He was playing for money, and the game was against the keenest experts. And so he started. First, he examined his experiences. On the one hand, using the fundamental approach, he was wrong. On the other hand, using the technical approach, he was right. Obviously, the best method was to try to repeat the successful approach he had used with Texas Gulf Producing. It wasn't easy. He sat with his stock tables every single morning trying to find another stock like it. Then one day he noticed a stock called M&M Wood Working. It was a stock he'd never heard of. It appeared to be rising. He knew nothing about its fundamentals and had heard no rumors about it. None of the financial services could tell him much about it. His broker had never heard of it. Yet its daily action reminded him of Texas Gulf Producing. He started to watch M&M Woodworking carefully. In December of 1955, M&M Woodworking rose from about $15 to $23.58 at the year end. After a 5-week lull, its trading volume increased and the price resumed its advance. He decided to buy 500 shares at $26.05. It continued to rise and he held on. Its volume of trading was consistently high. When it reached $33.25, he sold it and took a profit of $2,866.62. He was happy and excited, just as he bought Texas Gulf Producing. He bought M&M Woodworking purely on the basis of its action in the market. He knew nothing about it, nor could he find very much. He assumed from its continuing rise and high volume that some people knew a lot more than he did. The steady rise was due to a merger, which was secretly negotiated. Another company planned to take over M&M Woodworking for $35 a share. The offer was accepted. Nicholas was in complete ignorance, yet he sold out 2 points under the high. That's $2. A point is $1. His buying based on the stock's behavior enabled him to profit from a proposed merger without knowing anything about it. This is known as risk arbitrage. Dr. Yaakov Amahud is the Ira Rennert Professor of Entrepreneurial Finance at the New York University Stern School of Business. At the turn of this century, he conclusively confirmed that changes in volume foreshadow changes in price, just as Darvas wrote so many decades ago. This is termed price impact. Nicolas Darvas explains that price impact is a source of his remarkable stock market returns when he writes, "The experience did more than anything to convince me that the purely technical approach is sound. It meant that if I studied price action and volume, discarding all other factors, I could get positive results." Warren Buffett writes in the Essays of Warren Buffett that some offbeat opportunities occasionally arise in the arbitrage field. I participated in one of these when I was 24 and working in New York for Graham Newman Corp. The profits were good, and my only expense was subway tokens. To evaluate arbitrage situations, you must answer 4 questions. How likely is it that the promised event will indeed occur? How long will your money be tied up? What chance is there that something still better will transpire? A competing takeover bid, for example. And what will happen if the event does not take place because of antitrust action, financing glitches, etc.? Most practitioners buy into a great many deals, perhaps 50 or more per year. With that many irons in the fire, they must spend most of their time monitoring both the progress of deals and the market movements of related stocks. Hence, Darvas finds that the technical approach is indeed proven sound. This meant that if he studied price action and volume alone, he could get positive results. He now began to try to work from this point of view. He concentrated on a close study of price and volume. He tried to ignore all rumors, tips, or fundamental information. In short, he blocked out all the BS. He decided not to concern himself with the reasons behind a rise. He figured that if some fundamental change for the better takes place in the life of a company, this soon shows up in the rising price and volume of its stock, because many people are anxious to buy it. If he could train his eyes to spot this upward change in the early stages, as in the case of M&M Woodworking, he could participate in the stock's rise without knowing the reason for it. But how? He began to compare stocks with people. This is how he began to work it out. If a tempestuous beauty were to jump on a table and do a wild dance, no one would be particularly astonished. People expect that. But if a dignified matron were suddenly to do the same, people would say, There's something strange here. Something has happened. He decided that if a usually inactive stock became more active in terms of volume, he would consider this unusual. If it advanced in price, he would buy it. He would assume that somewhere behind the out-of-the-ordinary movement, there was a group who had some good information. Buying the stock would make him their silent partner. In May 1956, Nicholas has hit and miss results when he writes, "Sometimes I'm successful, and sometimes I was not." What he did not realize was that his eyes were not sufficiently trained yet. He was in for a rude awakening. He notices Pittsburgh Metallurgical trading at $67. He thought it would continue to rise. He buys 200 shares for $13,483.40. The stock tanks. 10 days later, something is clearly wrong. The move was there, but in the wrong direction. He bought at the top. Pittsburgh Metallurgical drops to $57.75. Nicholas sells for a $2,023.32 loss. This is a 15% loss. It rises as soon as he sells. He does not yet understand that the market has a rhythmic pattern of surge and reversal. He discovers an explanation in that he buys at the top of an 18-point rise. He bought at the wrong time. The problem is he doesn't know how to judge a movement at the time it happens. He knew that the book accounting systems did not help. Balance sheets were useless. Accounting information was suspect as wrong. On a whim, he studies individual stock movements. How do they act? 10 days later, something was clearly wrong. The move was there, but in the wrong direction. He'd bought at the top. Pittsburgh Metallurgical drops to $57.75. Nicholas sells for $2,023.32 in a loss. This represents a 15% loss. It rises as soon as he sells. He does not yet understand that the market has a rhythmic pattern of surge and reversal. He discovers an explanation that he buys at the top of an 18-point rise. He bought at the wrong time. He understands now that a big problem is how to judge a movement at the time it happens. He knew that book accounting systems did not help. Balance sheets were useless. Accounting information was suspect as wrong. On a whim, he studies individual stock movements. How do they act? What are the characteristics of their behavior? Is there any pattern to their fluctuations? He reads books. He examines stock tables. He inspects hundreds of charts. A pattern emerges. Defined upward or downward trends, once established, tend to continue in consolidation patterns where prices channel into boxes. A box is a series of frames in which the share price fairly consistently oscillates between a low and a high area. Nicolas Darvas describes this area, which enclosed this up and down movement, as a box. Thus emerges the box theory. This would lead to his fortune. This is a chart of Facebook displaying the box theory. This shows that stocks behave the same way today as in the 1950s when Darvas was alive. He started to watch stocks when the price was in the highest box. The boxes of the stock had to stack up on top of each other like a pyramid on increasing volume. It could bounce all it wanted to between the high and the low of the box, and he would do nothing. If it did not bounce up and down inside its box, he was worried. Notice how nobody wants Galectin stock. No bouncing is bad. No bouncing, no movement meant it was not a lively stock. He is not interested in non-lively stocks. This meant that it would probably not rise dynamically. Nicholas defines his boxes with a special nomenclature he calls frame figures. A 45.50 box has a low of $45 and a high of $50. It could bounce between this low and high often, and he would still consider buying it. If it fell to $44.50, he eliminated it as a possibility. Why? Anything below $45 meant a lower box. He only wants a stock moving into a higher box. A stock sometimes stayed for weeks in one box. He didn't care how long the price action stayed inside the box if it did, and it did not fall below the lower frame figure. He gives an example of a 45.50 box. 45.47, 49.50, 45.47. The stock could only react to $45 upon reaching 50. It could touch 50 but must stay above 45. He constantly watched for a thrust above 50. Then he bought it. He had no fixed rule. He just had to be sure to see it and act. Some volatile, eager stocks moved into another box within hours. Others took days, pushing from its 45.50 box into another upper box he says could look like this: 48, 52, 50, 55, 50, 53, 52. Look for the high and low, and you can see that it has formed a new 48.55 box. The range of the box is what he had to decide. His problem was that this varied with different stocks. Some stocks had a small frame of 10% each way. Other wide-swinging stocks moved 15 to 20%. Part 1 of his solution was to define the frame exactly. Part 2 was to sell the stock on a drop below the lower edge of its box. Reactions are normal as long as the price action stays within its box. A reaction is defined as if in a 50-45 box the price rises to $50 and then plummets to $45. A drop in an uptrend or a rise in a downtrend is a reaction. Notice that the Nicolas Darvas definition of a reaction is a precise technical support level. This allows him to precisely define his risk before entry. If it did not penetrate $45, the reaction did not mean that the price was going to fall. He considers this equivalent to a dancer crouching, ready for the spring up. Stocks rarely shoot from $50 to $70 in a day. Uncle Paul Samuelson said that the stock market crashes were no different than Darwinian forces that culls weak animals from the herd. Darvas notices that a reaction to 45 in a 45.50 box has a benefit. It shakes out the weak and frightened shareholders who mistake this reaction for a drop. This enables a stock to advance rapidly. Hence, reactions are sometimes referred to as shakeouts. There was a feeling of proportion about a stock that was on a definite upward trend, rising from, say, $50 to $70, but occasionally dropping back was all part of the right rhythm. 50.52, 57.58, 60.65, 52.56. This is a 52.60 box. On an upward swing, it might have gone 58.61, 60.70, 66, 63.66. This put it well inside a 63.70 box. Another major problem he had was, logically, it was when the share price entered a new higher box. Modern science has shown that simply buying a stock because it's rising offers the highest expected returns. The share price of Louisiana Land and Exploration formed its pyramiding boxes for weeks. He felt that he had assessed it correctly as on the rise when the share price entered the upper frame of its last box at $59.50. He orders his broker to call when it hit $61, the level he considered to be the door of its new box. When the broker calls, it is at $63. He felt deprived of a great opportunity. Up it went, 63.5, 64.5, 65. He was right, but he'd missed it. He buys 100 shares at $65 at the top of the new box. Nicholas was a baby at trade management. His broker explains that he should have put in an automatic on-stop buy order. This is more commonly called a buy-stop order. The stock would have been bought when it rose to $61. Nicholas decides to put in a buy-stop order for entry above the top of the box. He uses this concept 3 times consecutively for $2,442.36 in profit. He does it in a Allegheny Ludlam steel, which appears to enter a 45.50 box. He buys 200 shares at 45 3/4 and sells $51 in just 3 weeks for an 11.5% return. Dresser Industries seems to enter an 84.92 box. He buys 300 shares at $84, but it falters in the box. He sells at $86.50 for a 3% return. Cooper Bessemer is bought at the edge of its 40.45 box. He bought at $40.34 and sold at 45 1/2. He buys 500 North American Aviation at $94 3/4, anticipating a new box over $100. It falls. He loses all the profit from the last 3 trades. This is the turning point. He realizes he will be wrong 50% of the time. He must become impartial as a diagnostician in identifying with a theory or stock. He has to reduce his risks to the minimum. His quick loss weapon is that he knows he was wrong half the time. Why not sell at a small loss? If he bought at $25, why not at the same time order the stock be sold if it returned below $24? He places stop-loss orders at a certain figure with an initial stop-loss order in case the stock price dropped. He knew that many times he'd be stopped out, then watch helplessly as the share price climbed. This was not as important as stopping a big loss. He can always buy the stock back at a higher price. Coin flip odds won't work. If he invested $10,000 in the medium price stock, it would cost him $125 in each purchase and sale, or $250 a round turn. In 40 trades breaking even before commissions, his $10,000 would be gone. A solution is that his profits had to be bigger than his losses. He uses a trailing stop loss he adjusts on each rise into a new higher box. His objectives and weapons are right stocks, right timing, small losses, big profits, price and volume, box theory, automatic buy stop order, stop loss sell order, and his basic strategy consists of the fact that he will always just jog along an upward trend, trailing his stop loss as insurance behind him. As the trend continues, he'll buy more. When the trend reverses, he'll run like a thief. There was bound to be a lot of guesswork. Being right 50% of the time was probably optimistic. He saw his problem more clearly than ever. He must adopt a cold, calculated, unemotional attitude towards stocks. He must not fall in love with them when they rise. He must not get angry when they fall. There are no good or bad stocks. There are only rising and falling stocks. He must hold the rising ones and sell those that fall. His greatest challenge was that he knew that he had to achieve something much more difficult than before. He had to bring his emotions, fear, hope, and greed under complete control. He had no doubt that this would require a great amount of self-discipline. Darvas felt like a man who knew a room could be lit up and was fumbling for the switches. I recommend that all traders study an anger management course that helps investors control urges, become less impulsive money managers, and thus more disciplined stewards of family wealth.